Hi, and welcome to a Small Medium at Large podcast. I'm your host, Gail Heisen, bringing you intimate stories that heal. Today, we have a very special guest coming to us from San Francisco, Kirk Schneider. Let me tell you a little bit about Kirk. Kirk J. Schneider is a leading spokesperson for existential, humanistic, and existential integrative psychology, an adjunct faculty member at Saybrook University and Teachers College, Columbia University, and a co-founder and current president of the award-winning Existential Humanistic Institute. He is also a 2022 candidate for president-elect of the American Psychological Association. Dr. Schneider's work has been featured in Scientific America, the New York Times, USA Today, The Guardian, Vanity Fair, Forbes, Health, BBC, Psychology Today, and many more. Dr. Schneider is a fellow in 7 divisions of the APA, the recipient of the Rollo May Award from Division 32 of the American Psychological Association for outstanding and independent pursuit of new frontiers in humanistic psychology. And he's also the author and editor of over 14 books. These include The Paradoxal Self, Horror and the Holy, The Psychology of Existence with Rollo May, Existential Integrative Psychotherapy, Existential Humanistic Therapy with Aura Crew, Awakening to Awe, The Spirituality of Awe, The Polarized Mind, The Depolarization of America, and today his newly released book, Life-Enhancing Anxiety, Key to a Sane World. Let's welcome Kirk here today. Hi, Kirk.
Oh, hi, Gail. Thanks so much for the rousing introduction.
Oh, well, there's so much more. I had to limit it down to that small page.
I'm duly humbled.
Quite a lot of accomplishments. As I do before we get to your book, which we'll get after a few questions, I always start with the beginning in life here with all my guests as much as I can, asking what happened in their childhood life, growing up family that put them on a path, which for you would be intense amounts of psychology, being a psychologist and studying and writing so much to help others. Was there anything in your life growing up that you said, like some kids at 10 say, I'm going to be a doctor, and they become a doctor? Did you have this with psychology?
Well, I absolutely did, Gail. In fact, the core of my book is my own story in many ways, and I hope that it relates. I do think it relates to many other people, but I really got introduced to psychology at about 2.5 years old.
Wow.
My 7-year-old brother died
Mm.
after a 10-month struggle with an illness. And as you can imagine, it was a shattering for me, for particular my parents. It's unimaginable to even fathom what it would be like to lose a child. So I was in my own void for quite a period of time, and had a lot of panic and anxiety from a very early age. In fact, one of my earliest memories, probably my earliest memories, is of my parents weeping on the couch. So that's very vivid in my mind.
So you were experiencing loss and death at a very young age that usually doesn't happen in a family.
Exactly. So I was introduced to questions, to issues that generally come much later about, why we're here and what is death all about. I certainly was terrified of death and illness as a small child. And I was very fortunate to have very psychologically minded parents. They were my mother was particularly overcome for a period of time, but they both were understandably very thrown by
Mm.
the event. But my mother also had the wherewithal to seek out a psychoanalyst, actually, which was very unusual. Middle-class family in the Midwest, and she got an analyst to help her with her major challenges, and she asked that analyst to refer an analyst to me, child analyst.
And how old were you then?
So I was 6 years old, and I described that in the book. I actually, as you know, I decided to take the risk of exposing the notes of my psychoanalyst about me at 6 years
Mhm.
old, and about my parents, our initial session. But it was one of the pivotal periods of my life, because even though my parents did everything they could to support me, I was drowning in many ways.
Mhm.
You'd probably say kind of losing touch with reality in some ways, rage, fear, terror,
Anger.
nightmares.
Mm.
My father was a humanistic educator, so he also was wonderfully attuned to psychology. He was a math and science teacher at the time, eventually became a professor of education. And he did all he could too. But having that person, a seasoned professional who I had the sense had been through a lot himself. And there was something about his presence that was extremely powerful for helping me shift basically from a place of terror and in many ways paralysis to gradual curiosity and intrigue about the world that was ripped open to me and the big questions from a very early age.
Like where do we, when you're a child and you've had that loss, you were wondering, where did your brother go? Where
Yeah,
is he
absolutely.
now? And how can that be explained by
Yes,
an adult?
yes. And
And
yeah,
so it seems like psychology was helping you to heal and go through this trauma by getting you psychoanalyzed and by having a father who was really there for you in as much of a way as he could be.
yes.
And so would you credit that for you being a whole person now, being able to go through that the support of those people led you to say, I think psychology really helps, and I think I'd like to help other people? Was that something about the thought?
Well, you really captured it. That was a lot of what was budding in me from a very early age. Um, yeah, and I would definitely add my mother in there as well, as she got her footing. Uh,
Mhm.
you know, helped to raise me actually in many ways, because they eventually divorced because they did have a lot of conflicts in terms of just their life philosophy, etc.
So I think maybe you know better from psychologist's point of view, but from what I've seen, a lot of times the marriages that people have can't withstand the loss of the child, and often there is a divorce. I've had a few shows here with people who have lost a child, and even though they're so courageous and they speak so amazing on the show, it still brings me to tears to listen to it, because to me that also, it's up there in one of the biggest, most difficult things to handle on the
Yes,
things that life dishes out.
yes,
So I want to say I'm glad that you're, in the position that you're in, and that you've been able to heal from this particular experience. And I can understand that this might have led you down the path to where you are today.
yes.
So I'd like to go into the next question for our listeners, which is, could you explain what is an existential humanistic integrative psychologist, and what is humanistic psychology?
It is a mouthful. Uh, well, I guess I'll give you the short answer because the long
Okay,
answer would take many seminars, right?
okay, we'll have to go smaller, yes.
Right, yeah. I mean, basically, humanistic existential psychologists are attempting to get at the root of our challenges as human beings, and to do all we can to help people really confront what deeply matters about their lives.
Mhm.
You know, the big picture questions, like we were just alluding to, that opened up to me very early. But yeah, I mean, I would say the way I'd summarize it is that they home in on two basic questions for the patient or client. How are you presently living? In other
Mhm.
words, what are the struggles or the battle, as we call it, that you're experiencing? And usually the battle has something to do with something that's trying to emerge and break through in your personality, usually trying to liberate you in some way, experience greater freedom to pursue a relationship, a job, a project, something deeply meaningful. And then the part of oneself that is blocking oneself and crushing oneself,
Mhm.
keeping oneself down from that. And so that's the first kind of, it's a both implicit and sometimes explicit question. And then on the heels of that question is, okay, based on how you're presently living, how are you willing to live? But go ahead.
So when you do this type of therapy with a client or a patient, however we want to refer, is that all a talking type of therapy, or is there body work done with that, or how do you approach that?
Well, it's a mixture.
Oh,
Now, I consider myself an existential integrative therapist, meaning that I do believe that there's a place for medical intervention with some people at some moments, maybe even to get through the week, uh, or direct somatic interventions, you know, body work, et cetera, or massage or what have you, deep breathing. Um, I also think there's a place for cognitive behavioral work for some people at some points, but I don't see those as the be all and end all.
mhm,
And I think for many people to fundamentally heal, they need to go into, be as fully present as possible to the anxiety that they've been struggling with, to the root, so to speak. And that requires more than just talking, in my view.
mhm,
I do think that there's a place for interpretations as well. Again, at some points for some people, and maybe as a part of the deepening of the work and helping people to sort of bind their anxiety through understanding in a more intellectual or cognitive way what's going on, or maybe how childhood affected their current situation. However, again, as people go deeper, I find that they can no longer really put what they're going through in words. And in fact, if you're trying to reduce it to words, it can be somewhat of a desecration, actually, because you're not really meeting them. And they're starting to talk in metaphors like I'm drowning, I'm in a bottomless pit,
the
I'm
black
in free
hole.
fall. A black hole is very common. Yes, and these are all cosmic existential metaphors, which I very much felt as a kid, a sense of groundlessness and helplessness, as I
Mhm,
call it, that is at the root of so much of our anxiety. And in order to really help a person to work with and to a large degree through that kind of uh, turmoil, I believe very strongly, and my compadres believe very strongly in what we call an experiential approach with the client. So it's not just what we talk about, but how we're talking together. And in particular, how the client is holding him or herself as they are going into their struggle. What comes up for them in their body. So we call attention to, oh, Gail, I noticed that, you seem a little smaller as you say that, or your voice got smaller. I wonder what's going on for you right now. Or I suddenly felt a tightening in my stomach when you said that. I wonder if that resonates for you. So those kinds of invitations.
Very good description of my
Thank you.
anxiety.
Well, I don't know that I'm just kind of
I know
making it up, but
So I want to ask you about, while we're talking about what you just mentioned about, I've been watching, you have so many different people that are taking all these different medications. And
Yeah.
I'm thinking that there is, I do believe that when a person is, really in need of, or suicidal, or like it's a very extreme situation, there may be a point where those medications are very helpful.
Yes.
But on the rest of it, I feel like so many people are being drugged that shouldn't be drugged and should allow themselves to feel the feelings instead of taking this drug to stop having a feeling. And it
Yeah.
seems to be very popular. I mean, in whether it's my families or people, like, I've never had one of those. Like, whenever I have a death in a family or some really, and I take it very intensively, I want to feel all the pain of that.
Yeah.
I don't want to, I don't want to cover it up. I want it all to be able to come out.
Right.
But other people feel that it's much better to take, what is it, those things they take? I think Xanax, or I don't know what the names are, but there's names.
Benzodiazepines or antidepressants,
Yeah.
yeah.
And then I find that sometimes I think it really maybe didn't help them in the long run, because all of a sudden they maybe commit suicide. Or I'm just saying, I wanted to get your feedback on that in the professional world.
Yeah, I resonate very much with what you're saying. I see it as a very mixed picture, and I certainly don't want to devalue individuals' soul searching around choosing to take drugs for them to get a foothold, let's say, on living. And that I have certainly seen that in patients myself. I personally feel, even though it was quite harrowing, that I was glad that I was not bombarded with drugs when I was going through my crisis at a very early age. And then even later on, I had a kind of reactivation of that in graduate school. But it is a very a significant choice that I think, I mean, as a therapist, I really try to provide room for people to reflect on the meaning of taking the drugs or the implications for them. My problem in our society is that we tend to see these drugs or short-term solutions as the be-all and end-all. It's not that they're bad in total.
No.
My issue is that they are seen as, the kind of the solution with a capital S. And that's because I think it's because of our socioeconomic system emphasizes speed, instant results, and the appearance and packaging of things in many ways. That's just how we're brought up in so many ways. The quick fix model for living. So that's what I would caution people to really think about. Are you resorting to the medication to have that kind of quick fix, or to pretend that, that'll take care of everything and you can sweep everything else under the rug and this is the long-term solution?
Mhm.
I think for a lot of people, that's a real shortchanging. And it's actually, it's tragic in many ways, because sometimes that's all that's offered.
Yes.
That's where the humanistic, the existential, even the psychodynamic can be so important. What we call depth therapy, whereas more exploratory and staying in touch with what's going on in one's whole body experience, not just behavior or physiology.
So would you consider anxiety and anxiety, fear, would you consider those one of the same, or that fear is just a part of the anxiety, or
Well, fear is usually considered a fear of a particular object or thing, whereas anxiety is more diffuse. But um, I find it helpful to define anxiety as basically as the fear of the unknown.
okay?
I feel like that's at the root of anxiety. Um, it's not a fear of a specific object per se, but a fear, really, it's a primal fear. And I agree with Otto Rank here that it goes back to birth and the tremendous shift from a sense of, well, relative non-being and unity to sudden abrupt being and pandemonium.
Yeah,
When we're thrown into, the bright lights and the strange people and the colors, and I mean, it's just wild, right, at that moment. And I do think that is at the crux of our anxiety and the crux of existential anxiety. It's the terror of the radically unknown
I
and how
wonder
we deal
if
with that.
that's what my first child, who's a grown adult, um, I was in a near-death experience while I was giving birth to her.
Mm, mm,
And I've wondered now, she deals with a lot of anxiety. She's 45 now,
yeah,
and she has a lot of anxiety issues. And I've always asked her, I've always shared with her any of the people I know or things if she's interested. Uh, but I've really wondered about the fact that she's never done any psychological exploratory work on a birth that everybody around thought I was going to die while giving birth to her, because I was at home with my dad, we were raised with no doctors and dentists. And so my dad was delivering this baby when I was 21.
no,
And I was married to a wonderful man who was also terrified when they saw that I was not making it and turning purple, and it had been 36 hours.
right.
So I was luckily rushed to a hospital, and they said she's in the woods and we'll try and bring her out. But when I experienced that birth, it was the most beautiful thing with music and lights and sound. And I had this whole spiritual experience, not knowing what real birth was until I had two more children and just had the pain and labor of birth. I've
Okay.
often thought how I never felt fear when I was in that state, because I was out of body and I was
Yeah, yeah,
watching the whole birth and everything going on.
yeah.
Like, all I kept thinking was everything's going to be fine.
Well,
And uh, fortunately it was, and she lived and I lived and everybody lived and it all worked out. But I've often thought that was that the original trauma that has given this anxiety to this lovely person.
well, I wonder because it sounds like that actually may have been a saving grace, maybe in the midst of other turmoil and terror I don't
Mhm.
know, that she experienced, given it sounds like a lot of anxiety around her birth. Not so much you, right? But what you experienced sounds like that may have actually been more supportive of her, coming into this, you know, just wild new reality.
Yes.
Because what we're finding, and what I believe very personally, is that how the child is met by the caretakers and the culture. Culture has a lot to do with it because the caretakers often emulate the culture.
Mhm.
Sometimes they emulate transmitted trauma over generations as well. So the question of how fear-based that meeting is with the child,
Mhm.
as distinct from present oriented. And by present, I mean capacity to hold and illuminate, in a sense, what is palpably significant
Mhm.
between you and the child and within the child. That is really important. And this is something that psychoanalysts call a holding environment. I think Winnicott coined this term. And I think that's a really important.
I wouldn't let them take her from me. So they, and then they had to do whatever they had to do so I didn't go into convulsions, blah, blah. But I kept my husband there, and I said to the baby cannot leave my side, the baby can't leave the room, the baby.
Sounds like you did a lot of
And I
good things.
rushed out of the hospital the next day against medical advice because I wanted
Uh-huh.
to just go home and be with the baby, but it took weeks to
Uh-huh.
recover. But so you've relieved me of a little bit of guilt I might have been carrying just now.
Well, good.
So I
Yeah.
appreciate that. And I I want to go on to asking about what your book is about, but before I ask you that, you wrote here that you have been involved in something called the Existential Institute, Humanistic Institute. And is that something that exists now, or is that something for people to know about? I just wondered if you could share what that is.
Thanks.
Then I'd like to start talking about your book.
Yeah, the Existential Humanistic Institute, or EHI, has been around since 1997,
Mhm.
and we've been offering courses. I think we're perhaps the only, or certainly one of the few programs in the country to offer a certificate in existential humanistic practice therapy, and we've been working with students and professionals who want to specialize more or respecialize in existential humanistic therapy. And we've been doing that for about 8 years, offering that certificate. So if people want to know more about it, it's available at ehinstitute.org online. You can find out more about the training program. I'm the current president of the institute.
Great. So we'll also add that in our description in case anybody is watching the show and needs to find out how to contact. We'll have it all in the description.
Correct.
So I want to go to life enhancing anxiety,
Mhm.
which I found it was like, how could you think of anxiety as this good thing or something? I don't know. What a thing. So if you give us a definition of life enhancing anxiety and why it's so important.
Well, I think it's the anxiety that we actually need to face to
Mhm.
avoid or prevent the torrent of anxiety that we're experiencing as individuals and as cultures often throughout the world today. That anxiety is often the result of having not faced this deeper, more vital anxiety that I call life enhancing anxiety. And again, I think it can begin at birth, where it's basically the capacity to live with and make the best of the depth and mystery of existence. I know that's a mouthful. So another way to put it is it's the attempt to, I mean, it's the capacity to live with and make the best of the differences that we encounter from the moment of birth, the contrasts and contradictions that we come into that often, end up as fear-based prejudices, reactivities, knee-jerk reactions that we have toward certain people or places, things, and trauma can certainly, accelerate that, kind of rips us open to those fears if it's not dealt with, especially. So basically, life-enhancing anxiety can be a very invigorating anxiety. Because it includes elements of wonder and discovery, not just, dread and apprehension.
Mhm.
That is certainly a part of coming into life enhancing anxiety, that one needs to learn how to deal with, uncomfortable conversations and feelings, situations. But I'm really trying to paint a more holistic picture of the dimension of anxiety that actually my forebear, Rollo May, my great mentor and friend, wrote about in 1950. He wrote The Meaning of Anxiety, and he was very intent on bringing anxiety more to the forefront of our culture. Even then, he was concerned that we were becoming much too mechanistic,
Mhm.
quick fix oriented, and we were covering over the need to deal with deeper issues, deeper questions, like what really matters about life. How do we really want to live our lives? And that's naturally going to bring up some of the difficult anxiety along with the invigorating anxiety. Is that making sense?
Yeah, well, I'm sure all of us have been stricken, whether they have the experience of losing somebody close to them, and then they realize about their own mortality, that they're not going to be here forever either. And all of a sudden they're stricken with fear of death and filled with anxiety, even though they're mourning the loss of someone. It's bringing up all those issues for themselves.
Yes.
And I found some great comfort that I asked, I was at a retreat for the spiritual care of the living and dying, I think was the name of it. I'm not sure, but it was led by Sogyal Rinpoche, who wrote the book, the Tibetan Tibetan book of living and dying, or I can't remember exactly.
Mhm.
But I figured this was a Buddhist man, or this man should be able to answer my question.
Mhm.
So I said to him, are you ever afraid of death? Do you have any fear of death? Because I know he believes in reincarnation, and he's a spiritual guy, and he's a leader. And
Mhm.
and in front of the 400 people in our audience, he stood up and said, yes, I have been stricken with fear of death. And that gave me so much comfort to know that when that feeling arises, this is a feeling that everybody experiences, even a spiritual teacher who spent his life, meditating and knowing about reincarnation.
Absolutely.
So I think sharing some of the anxiety things helps to lessen the power of it. And I think the experience that I just had that I want to share with you is maybe what you're telling me as I've been reading, I've read, almost finished your book, and I'm thinking this is what you're trying to get across, but I'm not 100% sure. So I'm going to tell you the little story.
Yeah.
I think it was August, so it's only this year. Just August that just passed. I had to go and have cataract surgery. And because of the upbringing that I told you about from when I was 21 and that life of no doctors, and the indoctrination that doctors will only hurt you, and if you go to a hospital, you're gonna die, and the different things my father said over and over again, I have a deep fear of medical interventions of any kind. But I didn't realize how deep it was until 2 days before I was set for that surgery, and I went into a complete state of anxiety, like I read about in your book. That is not normal. I don't have that kind. I have regular stomach and whatever. But this was an anxiety where my body was stricken to a paralyzing state, where I couldn't get off the couch. I couldn't hardly talk. And my kids were coming and saying, are you okay, Ma? Are you okay, Ma? And I was just frozen because I was so scared to go and take this surgery that everything in my whole being was in anxiety.
Yes.
And I realized, I said, this must be the time when people give people tranquilizers for this, because I
Right.
couldn't even hardly walk, let alone. And I couldn't alleviate it. There was nothing that would get this. And so I had to do what I call dark night of the soul, or whatever you want to call it. I had to go through all this, even to the point, I mean, this was going on as I was entering the surgery room, I was shaking like a leaf.
Wow.
And the people were saying, the doctors and nurses, oh, everybody feels like this. I said, no, you don't understand where I'm coming from. I said, I was dying at home from preeclampsia and toxemia, and I wasn't going to a doctor. So when you understand the depth of this no medical intervention, it's up to the moments of death. It's not, oh, I just don't feel good.
Right, right.
And so I had to get from the side of the fear of thinking that my whole life's been told to be afraid of this, to going to the fact that, wait a minute, you can't see to drive now. You have to do this so you can get your vision back. But nothing intellectually could take away the experience.
Yeah.
And that was how I entered, and I was crying and I was a mess.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I went through all of this anxiety intensity for 2 straight days and showed up and did the surgery and, never took a calming pill of any nature. And when I came out the other end, it was like I'd been through a trauma of a lifetime,
Huh.
that I was like, I don't know if it's the ashes and the phoenix rising thing, or
Yeah.
something very powerful transformed by sitting there and going through and facing the intensity of that anxiety.
Yeah.
I returned 2 months later, or whatever it was, when they do the next eye. Nothing. I had never experienced it. I went right, I was smiling, making jokes. All the nurses that were in the attending surgery room said, you don't seem like the same person that was here last time. What happened?
That's a beautiful illustration.
And I'm 67 years old. This is
Yes.
not something that happened 20 years ago. This is something that was an extreme anxiety experience related to having any medical intervention.
Yes.
I
Yes.
feel that now, well, I was able to actually return as a happy, present person. And
Yes.
to me, that was, I was very surprised about this experience.
Well, my guess is that you were able to reoccupy the parts of yourself that you had blocked off before in some way by staying with the process. You came into the more of who you are somehow,
Mhm.
and were able to realize that you are more than just that particular terror, and that you're beginning to see other possibilities,
Yes.
like, well, that it would help your vision. That might have been one hint in that way. But it sounds like a lot of this is beyond words, that it has a lot to do with you, like you say, going through a dark night of the soul. The it's a newfound capacity to be more fully in your own being. That's how I would describe it. That's how I felt going through my
And it was healing. It was
with feeling,
healing. It
with
took,
healing.
I don't want to say like it was a walk in the park. No, it was not easy. And it was physically, mentally, emotionally, and having your family look at you look like that. It had all those aspects, but
Yes.
when it came to the other end of it, it was like I was a different person. And
Interesting.
that was not, I don't want to take up any more time on this, but I just felt that when I was reading about what all the positiveness is you were saying about anxiety, I felt like that maybe that rang a bell into what you were saying.
Very much rings a bell. And of course, that's not for everyone. People
Yeah.
have all kinds of levels of fragility. So, I mean, that's very admirable that you were able to stay with it
It
without
took an inner
other intervention.
strength.
Yeah, well, I'm sure you called on your own healing knowledge in some way, awareness. I sense that you have a lot of experience in that realm, and that probably helped. But you are describing really well much of what I'm focusing on here in terms of life-enhancing anxiety. You were able to transform life-destroying anxiety, life-denying anxiety into life-enhancing anxiety to the degree that by going through that tumult, you now have a wider range. That's the sense I have. You tell me if I'm off base, but a wider range to experience your thoughts, feelings, body sensations, imaginings, the good, the bad, and the ugly,
Yes.
being human. And that is a wonderful gift. You can't put a price on a gift like that.
And it all had to do with physical anxiety and mental anxiety.
Yes.
And I'm grateful not to have drugged myself or done anything, that I went through it. Because as I said, the next experience of the next eye was just like, it was the most happy. I went happy. It was a happy experience. And who goes in happy to have surgery? But that's what it transformed to. So let's talk more about the book and how we're really that sort of answered my question about how it helps us to grow and transform in a positive way. I was wondering if you could explain something about in the book that you talk about called inner freedom. And then my next question would be something about awe. So tell our listeners, what's inner freedom? It sounded great.
I think you described it
Oh,
yourself and in your own experience. At least that's my experience of you and of my own dark night of the soul, is that having therapists who were deeply, profoundly present to whatever I was expressing, feeling, thinking in my deepest panic, them feeling like a solid, like a solid as a rock in their presence, was so powerful for me, because they were models in many ways of what one can be if one is able to stay with such stormy seas, and do it in a way that and enables them to still feel okay. I mean, clearly they were empathizing and in pain, sharing the pain themselves, but here they were, accomplished people who were able to hold that, again, back to that holding environment. And I feel like that really was so much of the work that I internalized, their modeling of presence and support for me to be more present, without words often, but just to, those upheavals I was experiencing emotionally in my body, attending to them, staying with them, staying with the associations or the images that came up as I stayed with them. It's a kind of unfolding process. And the longer and more intensively I was able to do that, the more I was able to access those places later on. And they just weren't as scary anymore. And I was also duly humble. I have a great deal of humility about the so-called unconscious of the human being, or the superconscious, whatever you want to call it. I think we are in a daunting situation as human beings. The question is, can you find ground within groundlessness? That's
well, because just the anxiety the world has been feeling over the last few years, which you also cover in your book. That was a wonderful thing about your book, was that you were bringing up present things that were going on right now, which there would be a lot of cause for anxiety, between war in Ukraine, or what's going on with Russia and the United States and China, or what's going, I can't, if I listen to, my husband likes to listen to Democracy Now! Every morning when he wakes up. If I hear that, by the end of the week, I'm depressed, and I don't know why I'm depressed.
Yeah.
I know that for my type, I'm better off, knowing what's going on, but only on a, I don't need to get deep into this.
Right.
I'm wondering about people that have this, like, is there an addiction almost? Or what goes on in our media and the world where everything is about being afraid? And the COVID, I mean, I didn't go anywhere for 3 years. I've been sitting in my house for 3 years, and
Right.
I'm wondering, how does that affect on a global way this anxiety, and how does that control the
Oh,
people
I-
where they could be more free if they were to read your book?
well, I'm sure it has affected people on a global scale. All these crises, political, racial, religious, etc.
Weather, fires.
Oh yeah, an individual depression, anxiety. But again, I think part of why it has had such a profound effect is because there are very few cultures in our world that are adequately preparing us to work with what I would call the more life enhancing anxiety earlier on, or more intensively as we're older. There's very little availability to what I would call emotionally restorative relationships. And I have a whole chapter on that, just making those much more available and affordable, especially to people in underserved areas. It's
Yes.
one thing for people like maybe you and I to have had some privileged mentoring and connections, but many people just don't have these, obviously. And the fact that we're not making that a priority in our culture is a major contributor, in my view, to the down spiral of a lot of people and cultures right now. So that being said, it's also very understandable of what we've been through. Our worlds have been shaken by COVID, and climate change, all kinds of things. So
And what
anybody,
about like the children that are being, that were like, my brother-in-law lives here not far from us, and both his children were born into COVID. I mean, one was born actually during COVID, and the other one was only a year old, I think, when COVID started. And I'm wondering what, when you grow up and for 2 years you see people with masks on all the time, I'm
right?
wondering what psychological effects this is having for those kids for the future when they're 10 years old, or
Well, it's a great question. And actually, they've done experiments. They're called the still face experiment, where it's usually the mother presents initially with the child, and they've done this as early as 2 hours after birth,
oh wow.
facing the child. And the first experimental condition is the mother is relating to the child, is responsive, is mirroring the child, delighting in their experience of the child. And then the second condition is the mother is told to put on a poker face, a still
Mhm.
face, just kind of go dead.
Right.
And it is amazing how quickly those children deteriorate. It's like
Wow.
they're falling off an emotional cliff. So I think there is a basis to your concern. At the same time, we're very resilient creatures.
Mhm.
And so there is almost always a place for some repair. And the point is to seek it and to have it available so that the youth, the young people can, and older people can uh, find new ways of relating to themselves and to others, especially relating to, that which was so different and estranging and scary.
You would think if they could teach about relationships in school,
Yes,
that's one of the things they don't teach about at
not
all.
enough.
And
Yeah,
instead you meet your bully for the first time there, or
that's right.
you encounter certain things in the kids that are running around, and you're not really prepared for that because you might not have been treated that way at home, and all of a sudden you go to this school and all these different things happen. Imagine if they taught compassion
Yeah,
and these sorts of things in school, how that would help the future of the next generation of people.
absolutely.
I
Or conversations across cultures within school.
Yes, yes.
Supportive, structured conversations like we're beginning to have in our broader culture.
So I want to ask you about another part of your book, which I didn't understand all about, and I was hoping you could explain.
Yeah.
and it had to do with the movies
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
horror films.
Hmm.
And what what were you trying to exactly? I didn't understand exactly because I don't watch a horror film. I can't.
Yeah.
The one I saw when I was a kid, partially of, I think it was The Living Dead or something like this, with the
Night of the Living
zombies
Dead.
walking. I was terrified with nightmares forever, and I just said I'll never watch a horror thing again. And
Yeah.
if I hear it in my house or somebody's got it, I just walk out of the room.
Yeah.
And
No,
I'm
I
one person, I still can't take a horror film.
yeah. I know. I respect that, and it's a lot of people who feel that way. Yeah. I mean, clearly, I'm coming from my own context to a large degree. I think it relates to some people, and in certain ways. But this whole idea that Susan Sontag talked about,
Mhm.
the potential value of the horror tale, especially a horror tale that is symbolic horror. It's not the slice and dice kind of thing that we see so much in movies today that have no philosophical dimension, that don't really raise questions about how you want to live your life or what are the possibilities in living. But basically her quote was to the effect of people who transgress in these stories go someplace that others don't go, and they know something that others don't know. And that has often struck with me because I was very fascinated by science fiction as a kid, especially as I was able to see my situation more with curiosity, with intrigue, wondering about big questions of why are we here, and what is this thing called life, and how would people handle strange events. So I'd watch Twilight Zone and Outer Limits, and then I began watching classic horror books and films. I wrote a book called Horror and the Holy, Wisdom
Yes.
Teachings of the Monster Tale. So I've been immersed in that whole thing, which may seem a little strange, but I think it relates very much to the life enhancing anxiety part, because it within these classic horror films, there's a cautionary tale about how
Mm.
the monster or the transgression goes way too far, clearly, because they become destructive often. But within that, often the inventor or the monster is opening a new world to the reader or the viewer, a world filled with strange possibilities, but possibilities nonetheless. If you just think about Frankenstein, the novel is about a scientist who is attempting to extend life, who is experimenting, who's inquiring into greater resiliency for the human being. He botches it all up, and I would argue that it's a lot of his experiment is fear-driven because of the death of his mother at childbirth, actually.
Mhm.
So it was more panic-driven than inquiry-driven, or maybe love-driven, love of wisdom. But yet it's there in the story. And Dracula also, I mean, here's a guy who could materialize and dematerialize and read others' minds and so on. Well, as I think you realize, we do see that there's a place for the paranormal. There are transcendent experiences that humans have that can be potentially fruitful or insightful. And these could be bases for future more expansive or even enriching ways of living. So it's the idea that these kinds of inquiries may not be comfortable, and certainly if we approach them more from that fear-based point of view, they can be destructive. But if we can be more present to figures or aspects in those stories that are attempting to convey something of wisdom, they can be, I think, beneficial for us.
You've given me a whole new view of what a horror film could possibly offer.
Yeah, well, I'm glad to hear that. I mean, the
Not a
film,
slasher film, but the ones you're talking about,
yes,
where
yes.
there's actually a message there.
What H.P. Lovecraft calls cosmic fear.
Yeah.
Really as well, and again, the deeper questions of living.
So my part two on that was after we talked about freedom was you've written a book and you mention it also in your book, which is what is living that you call awe?
Yes. For me, awe is probably the greatest outgrowth of life enhancing anxiety. That sense of awe squarely acknowledges our smallness and fragility before the vastness of existence, of the cosmos. At the same time, it equally acknowledges our great capacity to transcend that smallness and to venture out and to take risks and to explore and to feel our participation in something much greater than ourselves. This is why I think it's a beautiful transcendental concept. And there aren't many of these transcendental concepts out there that squarely address the paradoxes of our human condition. And
Is
so
that the I that is we, or that we are all one, the complete connection,
I
or
wouldn't say necessarily we are all one. What I would say is that it addresses the humility and wonder or
ah,
sense of adventure toward living. That's how I'd capsulize it. Sense of adventure toward living. You think about being on an adventure in a dark woods or something.
mhm.
You know the thrill that can come from that. The unknown can be very thrilling as well as unsettling and sometimes terrifying, right?
Done a lot of it myself. What do we
Unbelievable.
call it? Taking risks. Took a lot of risks.
Yes, yes. And I would imagine that you have been enriched because of that in many ways.
Absolutely. I'm
Uh,
grateful, even though at the time other people might have thought, why is she doing this? And even myself. But now when I reflect back, I see how those things actually changed my life. So
yes.
I'm very grateful for that. Oops.
So
Whoop,
if we can
excuse me.
develop an attitude toward living, right, of
Yes.
awe, you know, that can help to lift us from the narrow and petty identifications that we so often get into. And they're usually
Mhm.
judgmental and very critical of ourselves rather than opening up to the world, what's going on around us, the details of things, our connection with something much greater than ourselves, the amazement of this flash of light that we call life that's here so quickly. Can we tap in to it?
I I've experienced, I believe, what you're talking about, whether it's a radiance or being in awe of just an energetic presence, or and there's no word to describe it really. So you use the word awe, but it's really a bigger than that,
Yeah.
but doesn't have a word to describe it. But when you experience it, you know that you found.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yes.
That's the best word I could think of. And it's
So we're
cross-cultural.
getting up on our hour now, and I do have something I want to share from your book with everyone. And after that, I would just like to know if there was anything, unless you'd like to, before I read this, or after I read this,
Mhm.
I'd love to have just anything else that you'd like to share with the audience and listeners about your book. They can get this on Amazon. They can get it at Barnes and Noble. Is that right?
Yes.
And I'm wondering if there's any piece of wisdom or thing you would like to share before I share some of your wisdom, which I'm going to read instead of you, because I thought it was the most wonderful thing I'd read of in your book.
Yeah. Well, what I would share is that if you're suffering, struggling a great deal with anxiety, do your best to seek out a mentor, a helpful witness, as Alice Miller, the analyst, put it. Could be a caring neighbor, a friend, a therapist, who you trust has been there in some deeply resonant way, and yet has been able to come into that larger self, if you will, who can hold it and also can acknowledge it, but also go beyond it. And I just mentioned quickly several of the figures that I mentioned in the book that can be seen as models that show us that we can come into a life-enhancing frame on anxiety. If we think about people like Viktor Frankl, who suffered through some of the most depraved circumstances one could in the death camps of Nazi Germany, and yet his story in Man's Search for Meaning talks directly to this issue of being able to tap into his inner freedom, to use his imagination. In this case, he was thinking of his wife and of a very warm day, having a picnic and her smile, etc. Using his inner freedom to work with the horrible circumstances. Or Stephen Hawking with ALS. I mean, these are people who set the bar for finding the more of who one is. He was able to commune with the cosmos, even though his body was falling apart. Just a couple of examples to look to when we think about our own situation.
Very good examples. So what I'm going to share now before we close out the show in a little bit is something I've read in your book, and I know it's not something necessarily you would want to do, but I wanted to share this with the listeners because at each show I learn so much for myself, and I'm hoping that it's also giving these sharing healing stories, helping others. Actually, I know it is, because I've gotten some incredible comments and emails, and I'm so happy that the work I set out to do here is doing the job that I was hoping, which is touching people. And you have a list here of 19 practical steps under a piece in your book called Cultivating the Life-Enhancing Anxiety of Awe. So I think this is about the right part to put this in. And I'm going to just read that. It says, following are practical steps readers can take, or listeners, to enhance their experience of awe toward life. These steps are drawn from Kirk and other paths over many years of grappling with life-enhancing anxiety. So I'm going to read these to you slowly. 1, take time to reflect and be present. 2, develop a capacity to slow down. 3, develop a capacity to savor the moment. 4, focus on what one loves. 5, practice seeing the big picture. 6, cultivate openness to the mystery of life, including wonder and surprise. 7, cultivate an appreciation for the fact of life. 8, foster an appreciation of pain as a sometime teacher. 9, nurture an appreciation of balance between fragility and boldness. 10, seek contemplative time alone. 11, seek contemplative time in nature. 12, pursue contemplative time with close others. 13, travel. 14, experience in-depth therapy or meditation. 15, find an awe-based mentor. 16, cultivate an ability to trust the evolving nature of conflict, such as this too shall pass. 17, cultivate an ability to trust the evolving nature of life. 18, nurture an ability to give oneself over discerningly to the unknowable. And last, number 19, nurture an ability to trust the ultimately unknowable. I
Yes.
think those are really a wonderful list and good words of wisdom that I'm posting on my refrigerator so that others may
Love
also read that. And I also find it very timely in my life because I think those are important things to remind myself. And I think others also may find that too. And I just want to thank you so much for spending the time here with us today. I wish your book just came out in February. I wish you
Yes.
great success. I know you have so many other wonderful books, and our listeners can find out all the information on the description. And I want to just thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you so much for making this such a rich engagement with us. So,
I'm so glad, when you first meet on Zoom, you never know what's going to really happen.
I know.
So listeners, subscribers, keep sending us your comments, subscribe, share, tell your friends about our stories. Let's remember that when we share stories, stories can heal and we can help each other. Have a wonderful week, and we look forward to our next show in 2 weeks, and have a very great week ahead. Thanks so much for joining us, and lots and lots and lots and lots of love to all the listeners out there. Thank you.